In the consequence model slide that we looked at yesterday, I did have a wrong quote. I had for the last one 7 verse 17. It's supposed to be 7 verse 7 instead. So thanks for picking that up, Ruth. Little test there. Ruth passed. Good to see. Right. So here's our overall summary, a 30,000-foot view, as it were, of the prophecy of Micah. Godlessness brings consequences, but God will complete his purpose with those who listen and turn back to him. And what an exciting thing it is. There's the two elements, isn't it? The two elements that we've been looking at and will continue to look at. God isn't mocked. There are consequences associated with our decision to follow in him, but what a great and glorious motivation there is that we can be part of that great purpose that God has. And we saw again yesterday where this prophet prophesied. Such a tumultuous time, both in the ecclesia as well as externally, with the end of the northern kingdom of Israel and prophesying with Isaiah, his peer. And we also saw the prophecy, the three-part structure of Micah. This first bit, hear all ye people, and then the second and the third sections, which God willing we'll look at in our subsequents. And so today, this is what we want to try and cover off, the first part of Micah's prophecy, the prophecy that was specifically given to the people. And it was almost certainly delivered towards the end of Jotham's reign, so at the beginning of that, and into the reign of Ahaz. So it was a time when the people themselves, as if you can remember from our slide yesterday, the people were really grappling with what it meant to serve God. And we'll see that come through in the prophecy that's here. So let's pick it up from verse 2 of Micah chapter 1. We made the point in our introductory study that the power of this beginning of Micah's prophecy is somewhat obscured by the introductory details of verse 1, isn't it? We get this is who Micah is, this is where he came from, this is when he prophesied, and all of that tends to dull down the power of his message. Verse 2, how does he appear? How does his prophecy start? Hear, all ye people. Hearken, O earth. Pretty dramatic, isn't it? There's no introductory comments, no welcome everybody, none of that. Bang, straight in. Hear, hearken. And he reminds us of Elijah. Elijah did similar, didn't he? Everything was just a normal day in the court of King Ahab. The next minute, bang, in comes this hairy prophet. There won't be dew or rain for 3 years. Bang, and then he's gone. It was like, what was that? Well, Micah's a little the same. Comes on the scene. The middle of everyone doing whatever they were doing on that particular day, and bang, all of a sudden, this prophet's message comes through. But there's so much more than just the abruptness of the beginning of his message. He's actually quoting someone. Now, come with me back to 1 Kings chapter 22. Now, and again, as we go back there, keep a hand in Micah because we'll be moving between the two. So, as dramatic an effect as the beginning of his prophecy was, it actually has more to it than just the drama. Now, 1 Kings chapter 2, we find what actually is the same expression, the same words used. Have a look at verse 28. And as we read that, you're probably immediately struck by another similarity. And Micaiah said, if thou return at all in peace, Yahweh hath not spoken by me. And Micaiah said, hearken, O people, every one of you. It's interesting, isn't it? Micah is speaking a prophecy and begins his prophecy by quoting someone called, also a prophet, Micaiah, who ends a prophecy with the same words. And the Bible points us to this echo from the past. You can see the two. Here's the words of Micaiah, the prophet, and here's the words of Micah the prophet. And whilst in the English they look slightly different, if you have a look, you probably can't see that from up the back, but if you have a look at the actual Hebrew words themselves, you can see that they're the same. Micah in 1 Kings 22 says, hearken. You can see the Strong's number up there, 8085. That's the same word in Micah 1 verse 2 as hear. It's the same Hebrew word. Hearken equals hear. Hearken, says Micah, O people, Hebrew 5:971. That's the same word that Micah uses in Micah chapter 1 verse 2. The people, same word. Every 3605, one of you, hear all. It's the same word that Micah uses. It's exactly the same expression. Micah is quoting word for word the expression that Micah used in 1 Kings 22. Well, what is 1 Kings 22 all about? Well, it's the last recorded words of this prophet Micah. And Micah 1 is the first recorded words of the prophet Micah. Well, what's 1 Kings 22 about? It's the context of an ungodly alliance between Israel and Judah. If you cast your eye back again, you can see that this was the story with when Jehoshaphat came to help Ahab. Remember that story? They're going to go up and battle Ramoth Gilead. And the false prophets of Ahab come down and they prophesy, oh, it's going to be a great battle, you're going to be successful and all that. And Jehoshaphat's looking and saying, is there any prophets of Yahweh here? Well, there is one, Micah, says Ahab, but I don't like him because he never tells me what I want to hear. Remember that story? They go and get Micah. Micah then says, yeah, everything will be fine. And Ahab turns to him in the most unreasonable of all positions and says, don't lie. How many times do I have to tell you to tell the truth? Micah says, you want to hear the truth? I'll tell you the truth. All the host of heaven are sitting around, and how can we make Ahab fall? Remember that story? It's this one. One says one thing, one says another thing. Eventually someone says, well, I can go and be a false lying spirit in the false prophets that come through. God says, yes, that will work. And that whole story is built up to show that God is in control. That there's going to be consequences for Ahab. And a warning for Jehoshaphat. Don't make an ungodly alliance. And what happens? The fulfillment of Micah's prophecy testifies to its divine origin. You can see that in the words there. If, verse 28, the words we read before, Micah said, if Ahab, if you return in peace, Yahweh hasn't spoken by me. Listen, all you people, he says. Well, what happened? Ahab didn't return in peace. He got shot by the arrow, shot at a venture, smote him between the joints of the harness, even though he tried to hide out who he was, disguise himself, and he dies. And Ahab's death was proof that this was God's message. That Micah was speaking God's message. The divine origin of Micah's prophecy stood out for all to see. And Micah picks up that same expression. He picks up where Micah left off, we might say, in the context of this message coming from God. Warning, warning, don't make an ungodly alliance, Jehoshaphat. Don't align yourself in an ungodly way with Israel, with Ahab, of all people. And by picking up that same expression, Micah underscores the divine origin of the prophecy that he's about to say there. Isn't that a wonderful thing? Deliberately picking up the words of his namesake and using that as the foundation, the basis for the prophecy that he's going to give through the rest of his prophecies in Micah. the divine origin of his words. People should listen. If you didn't think it was worth listening to Micah, the prophet, just have a little ponder what happened so far as the prophecy of Micah was concerned. And then the prophecy goes on, back into Micah. The prophecy goes on and describes this sort of concept of a courtroom. Can you see that in verse 2? Hear, ye people, hearken, O earth, all that therein is, and let Adonai Yahweh be witness against you, Yahweh from his holy temple. Now that idea, or this idea of a witness or a court scene, is one that goes throughout this prophecy. It also comes up in Isaiah. If we have time in our last study, we'll have a look at how it's used in Isaiah. And remember, Micah and Isaiah, contemporary prophets, peers, and both of them use this same theme. If you turn over a couple of pages, you can see in Micah 6, this same idea of a courtroom. Micah 6, which is actually the third prophecy. Arise, contend thou. Let the hills hear thy voice. See that? Yahweh hath a controversy with his people. He's going to plead with his people. What have I done to you, says God? Wherein have I wearied you? Testify against me. See this same idea of a courtroom that comes up. God's judgments that he's going to bring upon the people here in Micah chapter 1, they're not unreasonable. They're not baseless. And that's the point God's making. I'm not accusing you of things that don't have their basis in fact. It's a reasonable thing that God does, isn't it? Just have a look, says God. I'm not making it up. I'm not conjuring up accusations against you out of thin air. Look at it. I can show you where you've gone wrong. There's a great logic. There's a great fairness with God. In fact, so great is his fairness that it's balanced towards us. He shows mercy where we don't deserve mercy. Despite the things that we've done, God will forgive them and count us white, clothe us with the Lord Jesus Christ. It's despite the fact that we don't deserve it. But he needs people, he needs us, brothers and sisters, he needs us to acknowledge those weaknesses, to acknowledge our sins before him. That process of forgiveness and cleansing cannot happen until we accept what we have done. So that courtroom scene is there. It's so appropriate. What God and what Micah are going to speak about are things that can be verified by fact, demonstrable. And so God describes this judgment that he's going to bring upon the people. He's going to come back and describe where the people had gone wrong. That's chapter 2. We'll have a look at that as well. But to begin with, he just describes this overflowing judgment. And it's quite intense words, isn't it? Behold, Yahweh cometh forth out of his place. He'll come down, he'll tread upon the high places of the earth. So here comes God from his holy temple, and he's going to destroy the places of idolatry that were there. But how does he do it? The mountains shall be molten under him. The valleys shall be cleft as wax before the fires. The waters that are poured down a steep place. And you get this idea of really a volcanic eruption. There's lava coming out. The mountains being ripped open. Wax that melts before a fire. Lava pouring down in a steep place. Now, it doesn't hurt for us to think about the awesome power of our God, does it, from time to time? He doesn't actually use the lever, we might describe it as. He doesn't use the lever of his physical power very often. Given that he created all things, he's the source of all energy, he dwells and consists of energy that would literally vaporize us in a second. God doesn't actually dwell on that very much. But every now and then we get insights into what we can only describe as indescribable power. And this is one of those examples. And it doesn't hurt for us just to reflect on that, does it? We see awesome manifestations of power in nature. Well, they're just snippets of the power that rests with our God. That's the God that we have come to serve. And this is God's work. Have a look in verse 6 and 7 here. See the emphasis on the fact this is God's work. Therefore, says God, I will make Samaria a heap of the field. I will pour down. I will discover the foundations. Verse 7, halfway through. The idols thereof will I lay desolate. God is personally intervening in this judgment. What was about to come was not just the random machinations of chance. This was God bringing to pass his judgments. And whilst this prophecy, to some extent, was given to both Israel, Samaria in the north, as well as Judah, Jerusalem in the south, the reality was that the opportunity for change was really focused on Judah. Unfortunately, as we made the point a class or so ago, unfortunately, Samaria was really too far gone at this point. Verse 9 describes them as covered in incurable wounds. See that? Her wound is incurable. And the danger with this wound is that it was contagious. It's come unto Judah. So you can see the warning that Micah has here, the warning that God gives the people, is primarily focused on Judah. Judah, now is your time to change. You don't have much more time because that incurable wound is coming. You're catching. I mean, we understand that, don't we, in the current context? The fact that everyone out there is, wearing these things, we understand contagion. If you believe some things, someone walks 100 metres away and you catch it, not quite, but, well, that's the warning here. You've got to do something about it. Wear a spiritual mask, I guess, was the message that Judah is being warned against. I just made that bit up, though, so if that doesn't fit sort of contextually, you can scrub that out. It worked, did it? Okay, thanks. Thanks, was right. So this is the opportunity that Judah had. And again, we saw that little beautiful reflection on Micah, the man Micah in verse 8, don't we? In this section that God is talking about his judgments and what's going to come, what is somewhat inevitable so far as Samaria is concerned, and almost inevitable so far as Jerusalem and Judah is concerned. In verse 8, Micah breaks out in sadness. What a great man. Yeah, perhaps that is the difference to Elijah, isn't it? Elijah was pretty happy to bring down the judgments of God. Fire from heaven. I only am left. Take all the prophets of Baal. Don't let one of them escape. Destroy them. That was Elijah. Micah, he gives a message of some pretty severe judgments coming. Oh, and he can't hold himself back anymore in verse 8, and he bursts into tears. That's a great man, isn't it? Someone that identified with the people. Someone that saw what they were going through as happening to him. One of them. Great lesson for all of us in that. It's easy to see things happening to others and say, well, to some extent they probably deserve it. That's not Micah. Micah feels their pain. And as we saw, such a great type of the Lord Jesus Christ, touched with a feeling of our infirmities, tempted in all points like as we are, that faithful high priest, the one that we can come to and know that he identifies with us. Sinless though he was, he identifies with us. Surely the most important characteristic of a priest. And then we come to this section. This is like the march of doom, this section from verse 10 to 16 of chapter 1. So God's painted the picture. I'm going to come down like a volcano because of the sins that have been done. It's going to be destructive because the wound is incurable. And Judah, you're catching the disease, says God. And what's the judgment going to look like? Well, that's verse 10 through to 16. A whole lot of places are listed. And these places describe the inexorable, steady, unstoppable march of the enemy right up to the gate of Jerusalem. You know, it's quite, I don't know what the right word is, ominous might be the right word, I'm not sure. It's almost, you know, when you can see something happening and you can't do anything to stop it happening. That feeling of inability to change the outcome, but knowing that the outcome is going to be an absolute disaster. Well, that's what you get here. And this prophecy lists off the different places. And it starts out with this cry that I think Micah says at the beginning of it, tell it not in Gath. He's about to describe something that's going to impact his beloved people that he identifies with. And in the same way that if you can remember it, same expression, when Jonathan and Saul died and David composed that Song of the Bow, and again he says, don't tell it in Gath. I don't want the enemies of God to rejoice over the destruction that's coming on the ecclesia. And this one starts the same way. Don't tell it in Gath. Because there's an inevitable march towards Jerusalem coming, which will be the manifestation of the judgments that God has described as a volcano coming through. And in a powerful way, every one of these places, every one of these place names is picked up in the context that is described. And the first one he says here, in the house of Aphrah, roll thyself in the dust. And so here you've got Jerusalem. Here we've got this coastal plain, the classic sort of transition or transit way for these mighty empires to come marching through as they fought in Egypt and up in above Israel. And we're not 100% sure where Aphrah is, but around about this area in the coastal plain. And look at the expression here, in the house of Aphrah, roll thyself in the dust. Now, you can look up, which I did, you can look up the meanings of these places. And not all of them are, easy to find out, but the vast majority are. A simple search, if you go to reputable dictionaries and things like that, even on the internet, will find that. Guess what Aphrah means? It means dust. So here, Micah, through inspiration, really picking up the judgments of God, Micah says, you're going to be rolling yourself in what you are, dust. Pass ye away, thou inhabitant of Saphir. That's a little below where we think Aphrah is. And what does Saphir mean? It means glittering, shining, glittering. But what's happening here? Having thy shame naked. Now, if you have a look in the margin, you'll see that where it says, thou inhabitant of Saphir, it actually is in the feminine, thou inhabitress of Saphir. It's picking up specifically the females. And this name of Saphir, which describes glittering, you can see people, as it were, dolled up, can't you? They're looking the part, they're wearing these glittering clothes, they're bejeweled. And there they are, and the prophecy is, you're going to be naked. The glittering's gone. Your shame is exposed to all. Then the next one. Thou inhabitant of Zaanan, come not forth. Guess what Zaanan means? Marching, to go forth. So the town of Zaanan was all about their power to go out, to determine their own destiny, to move forward, to march out. You ain't going to be doing that. Go not forth. In the morning of Beth Ezel, he shall receive of you his standing. That's a bit of an obscure one. For much of Micah, the old King James isn't necessarily the clearest translation. But Beth Ezel means a house joined. If you look at the ESV, for example, the ESV is a little bit clearer in this section. It says, the lamentation of Beth Ezel shall take away from you its standing place. So here the word's got the idea of a house joined. It's this collection of people standing firm. But in this prophecy, be taken away. Everything the house stood for, all the memories, the joys associated with that house, gone. Can you see how each one, Mike, is picking up the theme and the expression that is associated with each of those towns, picks up the meaning of that name. The inhabitant of Maroth waited carefully for good, but evil came down from Yahweh. Maroth means bitterness. They were going to experience bitterness, just as their name meant. O thou inhabitant of Lachish. You know what Lachish means? Well, it's a horse. Bind the chariot to the swift beast. See, again, it picks it up. Your name means a horse. You better hope you've got a fast one. She is the beginning of the sin to the daughter of Zion, for the transgressions of Israel were found in thee. Now, Lachish, and we'll see Lachish pop up in just a minute. And I haven't sort of been following on the map. Hopefully you have as we've worked our way along. But can you sort of see this footstep by footstep making its way inexorably towards the final destination there? And Lachish has picked up the sins of Israel. They were becoming infected by that incurable disease that Israel had. Therefore shalt thou give presents to Moresheth Gath. Oh, imagine how Micah felt when he mentioned that. That's his place. That's his town. That's where he came from. That's his family. That's his relatives. And their name means a possession. They were going to be given as a possession to this inexorable enemy that was making its way forward as God poured out those volcanic judgments on the people there. The houses of Akzib shall be a lie to the kings of Israel. And Akzib means lying or disappointing. They were going to live up to their name. You know, in every one of these, you can sort of see that if the meaning of the word was negative, lying, bitterness, dust, then that's how the word was used. If the meaning of the name was positive, glittering, marching to go forth, a horse, a house standing, then the prophet turns that on its head. So it's going to be the opposite of what your name means. Marashah means an inheritance. Yet will I bring an heir unto thee, O inhabitants of Marashah. It's not going to be your heir. Someone else is going to come and take your inheritance. He shall come unto Adullam, the glory of Israel. And Adullam, which means their ornament, would become an ornament in the hand of this king. What a tragic thing that is. And you can see by the arrow, as they came down this sort of coastal highway and then made their way up towards Jerusalem, God had prophesied so clearly before that would happen. The pouring out of his judgment. Volcanic eruption, as he describes it. We know, because we've got the benefit of hindsight, the absolute accuracy of this prophecy. It's exactly what happened. In the time of Hezekiah, Assyria marched down and worked their way up to Jerusalem, just as foretold here in this prophecy. Jerusalem was besieged. But Micah 1 is written 30 years before that happened. See, when you read it as if it's happening, don't you? You read it with all the urgency of something that's happening as we speak. They're here. They're coming. They've destroyed this city. Now it's the next one. Now it's the one after, step by step. We can't stop them. Well, it wasn't going to happen for 30 years. There's a great lesson for us in that, isn't there, brothers and sisters? There's a great lesson for us in that. The urgency of Micah's prophecy predated the actual events by many decades, but the prophecy came to pass exactly as foretold. You don't need me to point out the lesson for us in that. It's a characteristic of the end of all ages that prophecies, well, they appear to be nothing more than possible outcomes, don't they? That's a characteristic of the end of the age. They're always not quite in the foreseeable future, always a little bit further on. It's worth going there. Let's go to 2 Peter chapter 3. Well-known words, but words that are so full of power and warning for us. Characteristic of the end of the age. It's not going to happen to us. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 2. Be mindful of the words which were spoken before by the holy prophets. It's an understatement, isn't it? Be mindful of those words spoken by the holy prophets, because, verse 3, there shall come in the last days scoffers, walking after their own lusts and saying, where's the promise of his coming? Since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation. And Micah would have given his prophecy around the end of Jotham, beginning of Ahaz's reign, and all things continued just as they had before. There's no one coming down there. Lachish was still fine. Safer was still glittering. For this they willingly are ignorant of, that by the word of God the heavens were evolved, the earth standing out of the water and in the water, whereby the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. So everyone that Peter's talking to here, and the warning for those in Micah's time, is you forget the flood. People thought it was a great joke that Noah was building the ark until the rain came. Verse 8, beloved, be not ignorant of this one thing. One day is with the Lord as 1,000 years. 1,000 years is one day. If the prophecy of Micah chapter 1 was going to be delayed 30 years, and one day is 1,000 years with God, what's 30 years? I haven't done the maths, but not much, is it? So far as God's concerned, it's instantaneous. And we know, verse 9, the Lord is not slack concerning his promises. Some men count slackness. It's not that he's not going to do it. It's long suffering. That's why it takes time. That's why there were 30 years. Because Micah was going to prophesy and then give opportunity for the people to respond, which, good news, they did. At least some of them did. He's not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. And here's the warning for us. The day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in the which the heavens shall pass away with great noise. We've heard this language before. The elements shall melt with fervent heat. The earth also and the works that are therein shall be burned up. That's Micah chapter 1, isn't it? How powerful is this exhortation for us? Micah 1, although not literally prophesying of our day and the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, and whilst we don't live in these physical locations, and whilst we don't exist in those towns, nor are we besieged in Jerusalem, the reality is the principles are the same. It's up to us to apply them, brothers and sisters, and that's Peter's point. Verse 11, seeing then that all these things shall be dissolved, what manner of persons ought we to be in all holy conversation and godliness? And that is the message of Micah. Godliness. Who is like Yah? Now is our time of opportunity. You know, when this prophecy of Micah chapter 1 came to pass, it would come to pass with a brutal reality. And again, there's a lesson for us in that, isn't there? Because the events of Armageddon on this world will be catastrophic. The impact will be earth-shattering, quite literally. And just come with me to 2 Kings 18. Now, we are jumping ahead a bit chronologically, as I said, because the actual fulfillment of this prophecy ended up happening some 30-odd years after it was given during Hezekiah's reign. But I want us to get a bit of a feel for just what it meant for the Assyrians to come. It's easy if we sit here in a nice auditorium. The worst thing we're being hassled with is the occasional fly that goes past. Well, what was it like when you were living in the time of the Assyrians? Have a look at 2 Kings 18. And this is about the reign of Hezekiah. And he's a great king. It's such a relief when Hezekiah comes in. Verse 3, he did that which was right in the sight of Yahweh. And we say, well done, Hezekiah. Hurrah! Verse 14, he removed the high places, break the images, cut down the groves, broke in pieces the brazen serpent that Moses had made, which the children of Israel still worshipped. Verse 5, he trusted in Yahweh, God of Israel. And so you should, Hezekiah, we say, as we do our readings. After him, there was none like him among all the kings of Judah, any that were before him. He clave to Yahweh. He departed not from following him. He kept his commandments, which Yahweh commanded Moses. And Yahweh was with him. He prospered whithersoever he went forth. And don't you feel that sense of happiness and excitement as we've got a godly king and we're reading about him, and the readings are fun because it's going to be good. And look at this. How good is this? He rebelled against the king of Assyria and served him not. Excellent, Hezekiah. You sort of get that feeling? Good on you. Trust in God, we say from our comfortable lounge rooms. Rebelling against Assyria came with consequences. Assyria didn't like people rebelling. Chapter 18, verse 9. Came to pass in the 4th year of King Hezekiah, the 7th year of Hoshea in the north, that Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came up against Samaria and besieged it. Imagine that. You're Hezekiah, you've rebelled, you're trusting in God, which he should do, by the way. I'm not reducing the godliness and the greatness of what he's doing, but now there's a reality, isn't there? There's reality, because Assyria is now just in the north. The end of 3 years they took it, even in the 6th year of Hezekiah, the 9th year of Hoshea, king of Israel. Samaria's gone. Samaria's gone. The incurable wound has been resulted in death. It's gone. But then they go. And you can imagine Hezekiah feeling the pressure, and all the faithful people in Judah at that time, they see Assyria come down into the north, and they're filled with fear. They're going to be next, they're going to be next, and Samaria's gone, and they fall, and it's no more. And now they're going to come to, oh no, they've gone. Well, that's what comes, brothers and sisters, of trusting in God. Can you imagine how we might be, have special effort, thankfulness to God. He hasn't brought the Assyrian against us. Trial is over. Good news, our prayers have been answered. Verse 13. Now in the 14th year of King Hezekiah, did Sennacherib, king of Assyria, come up against all the fenced cities of Judah and took them. Can you see the tragedy of that? He's back. And he's successful. Yeah, I don't know about you, maybe you've always had that perspective, but until I did this study, I'd never really thought about the fact, because again, we know the end, so we know about the 185,000 that are destroyed, wake up in the morning and they're dead, all of that. We look at that and we laugh at the quaintness of the English there, and we know the end of the story, and we rejoice in the end because we know it. No, this happened. This happened. And with Hezekiah in Jerusalem, he saw the fenced cities, not of Israel, not in the north, they'd already gone. He saw the fenced cities of Judah falling before the Assyrians. Afra, Saphir, Zainan, Beth Ezel, Maroth, Lachish. Can you see them falling? And what does he do? Verse 14, has this great faithful king. I'm not for one instant casting any aspersions on Hezekiah. This is just the reality of a true trial and test, isn't it? He is in desperation. Hezekiah, king of Judah, sent to the king of Assyria to Lachish. That's where he is, Lachish. He's halfway through, more than halfway through this inexorable walk towards Jerusalem, saying, I have offended, return from me. That which thou puttest on me will I bear. And he pays him $900 million. Has to strip the temple. Faithful man has to strip the temple to scrabble around enough money to send to this king of Assyria, because it's one thing to be faithful and brave and rebel against Assyria when they're back in Assyria. Pretty tough when they're there. And they've successfully made their way through. They're targeting the rebel. And you know, Assyria, we know from history, we know quite a lot about them, that classic modest people that they were. They made sure that history knew about it. They did their little freezes and things like that. And there's no doubt the Assyrian army was magnificent and successful. But I've got here, you might not be able to see it up there, but it's a quote from a chap who wrote Fighting Techniques of the Ancient World. And he says about them, they're an aggressive, murderously vindictive regime supported by a magnificent and successful war machine. That's, fairly to the point, isn't it? Murderously vindictive, aggressive, magnificently successful. And you probably can't see this, and it's probably just as well that you can't, but these are actual replications of freezes that were taken during the battle, after the Battle of Lachish. The Battle of Lachish. Having his head cut off. Impaled on spikes. Being skunned alive. That puts your faith to the test, doesn't it? Just down the road. And the stories come back of the few people that escape. And they tell stories of this. You know, there's another historian I was reading who said there was more to the scope of Assyrian brutality than sheer terror. Most of these punitive campaigns were usually conducted for mitigating rebellions that fumed around corners of Assyria. So, in a sense, the very nature of these brutal actions and punishments acted as a counter to the restlessness and apparent disorganised scope of the rebels and potential rebels. So why was Assyria, did they enjoy skinning people alive? Possibly they did, I'm not sure. But they did it deliberately. They were overly brutal against rebels. You rebel against us, you pay the price. And you can see that terror, can't you? You can see, we can feel for Hezekiah at this point in time. There's advancing Assyrians. They're coming. They're coming. What a test of faith. Footsteps of doom. Ruthless and vindictive, city by city, literally leading up to the gates of Jerusalem. What do you think Hezekiah knew was in store for him? He was the leader. He was the one that rebelled against Assyria. Oh, the others, they were just following. It clothes the life of Hezekiah with a little reality, doesn't it? Makes our heart racing that we have in our lounge rooms as we read these things, it puts it back into a little bit of perspective. Well, let's come back to Micah and see why it was that God would bring those fearsome judgments against the people. Micah chapter 2. You know, Micah chapter 1 was, if you like, the description of what would happen. This is the detail around the outcome, if you like, the consequence. Chapter 2 is why. Why? Why would chapter 1 happen? Because of chapter 2. And how we introduced to the people. Verses 1 and 2. Well, they spend all night plotting the different ways that they can personally profit at the expense of their brethren. And when the day comes, having spent the whole night coming up with new and ingenious ways of maximising their profits at their brother's expense, in the day, what do? Well, they put it into place. They implement it. They're not just dreamers, are they? They're not just people that come up with good, albeit wicked ideas, profitable, albeit wicked. No, they put it into place. Spend all night planning, all day, exercising their evil ways to personally profit. You see that come out in that verse 1, isn't it? Woe to them that devise iniquity. They work evil. When the morning is light, they practice it. See, these are active people. They're flat out, busy as anything. Oh, life's so busy. Spend all night coming up with plans to make more money at the expense of my brethren. If you've done the name and titles of God, you have one of these funny ones, because you get to the end of verse 1, it is in the power of their hand. That word power is ale, normally translated as in God, the ale there. We know what that means. So it's strength. Strength. It's the description of the strength of God, strength of the Almighty. And that's what these people were. Their God was the work of their hands. It's in the power of their hand. And they looked like they worshipped God. My word, they did. They looked the part. But they were worshipping the power of their hand. The God of their hand. The works of their own hands. That's a consistent warning, isn't it? That's a warning for us. It's probably easier for us now, in our age, than ever before to have the power of our own hand. There's lots of different ways of being able to determine our destiny, make our money. And how often can we spend working the late hours for the power of our own hand, the God of our own hand? They were so far from God, weren't they? They looked the part. And again, this isn't not talking about the Assyrians here. This is talking about the people of Judah, the ones to whom this prophecy is given. Hear now, ye people. These are the ones in the truth. But how far were they from God? Verse 2, they covet fields. Yes, I would like to add that one there. I'll do it. By violence, they take them by violence. Houses, they take them away. And the bit that made God very angry is they took a man and his heritage. They took the inheritance of people, the inheritance that represented the relationship that the ecclesial people had with God. The inheritance that represented their relationship to God was being taken away through covetousness, through violence, and people were adding it to their own accumulated wealth. How did someone get like that? You know, look at that. Oh, that's extreme. How? Well, come with me to Psalm 36. There is a sort of great warning for us. Because what the Bible does is it just shows things in their stark reality. It removes the niceties that we sometimes clothe our own lives with, don't we? We think, you know, it's not so bad because of this and that, and we cover it over, you know, wallpaper over the cracks, as it were, and we can sort of justify why it is that we do the things we do. But the Bible doesn't do it. It strips away all the wallpaper. It leaves the cracks open to be seen. And you have a look at Psalm 36, and it's this powerful description of how we, in the truth, end up becoming associated and thinking like the people in Micah chapter 2. You know, this is a Psalm of David, you know, the servant of Yahweh, the ESV puts it that way. And the ESV is quite helpful here. Well, I'll read through it, and you follow on in the King James Version. In Psalm 36, verse 1, transgression speaks to the wicked deep in his heart. Deep in his heart. Doesn't look too bad from the outside, does it? Looks quite good. Dressed conservatively, modestly, saying the right things, coming to the right places. Deep in his heart is where transgression speaks. There's no fear of God before his eyes. And that is the root cause. Do we believe in God? He flatters himself in his own eyes that his iniquity cannot be found out and hated. The words of his mouth are trouble and deceit. This is powerful. He has ceased to act wisely and do good. The bit that I find particularly chilling about verse 3 is that implies that once he did speak wisely, act wisely. Once he did do good. See how it says that? He ceased. This person has changed. Plots trouble while on his bed. Oh, that's just like those in Micah's time. He sets himself in a way that is not good. He does not reject evil. The warning is there for us all, isn't it? It's not a case of us looking and saying, how could they act like that? That is terrible. No, the warning's there. It's up to us, again, going back to Hebrews 4, verse 12, to use the Lord Jesus Christ, to use the word of God, to open us up like that sacrifice. So we can see for ourselves what's inside us, deep in our heart. Not wallpapered over, justified in a way that is so natural for us to do. And then the rest of Psalm 36 goes on so beautifully in contrast to speak about the greatness of God, the absolute faithfulness of Yahweh, the absolute truth of him. Nothing deep in his heart that's different or hidden from the way he appears. And again, it reminds me of Brother Con's comments in the introductory talk. The Lord Jesus Christ knew what was in man. Didn't need anyone to say, well, this person looks good, but they're bad. No, he knew it. He knew it. God knows it. It's only us that deceive ourselves. So, back to Micah chapter 2, we see this continuing on. The children of mankind can take refuge in verses 3 to 5 in the shadow of God's wings, because God is going to stand up and protect those people. It's such a beautiful thing, isn't it? We know it's consistent of God. He looks after the strangers. He looks after the fatherless and the widows. Yeah, he is this all-powerful God that can bring volcanic judgment. Shake the mountains, split them apart, make the rocks run out like wax. And that God is going to look after people that are being oppressed by others. Oh, imagine how, the power of having that God on your side, our God on your side. It's a great thing, isn't it? It's something worth reflecting on. Now, yes, and it's hard because it requires enormous faith, but Hezekiah's seeing the Assyrian and they're doing these terrible things to the people, but right next to Hezekiah is the biggest, toughest God you can imagine. And I don't mean that to sound irreverent, and I apologise if it came across that way, but in my mind, it's the the face of a child, isn't it? You know, like a child that might be, I don't know, whether they're being picked on or having a nasty dream. And they're frightened in the dream and they go alongside their dad and they're safe. You know that feeling? I personally remember it from when I was a little tacker. I couldn't get to sleep, desperately afraid. Snuck in, had to dodge mum. Snuck in next to dad and I was immediately safe. It's like a secure place. What was affecting me in the dream could affect me no longer. Well, that's what it's like here. This is the God we can trust in. This is our God, brothers and sisters. This is our God. How good is that? When the world's trying to take us away, we have God on our side who's tougher than anything else, stronger than anyone else, more powerful than anything else. We cannot lose with him on our side. We have the response of the people to the words of God in verses 6 and 7. And this is a sad thing in so many ways. They've just been told of what they have done wrong, and they've been told of what God would do to them. And what's their response? You know, there can be multiple responses, can't there? And God can work with some of those responses, but he can't work with this one. It's not very clear in the King James Version. You know, particularly you read verse 7 and it almost sounds like it's talking about how good God is. You know, and we could sort of say, oh, that's great. Do not my words do good to him that walketh uprightly. And that is true. That is not the context of those verses, though. What verse 6 and 7 are verse 6 and 7 are the response of the people to the words that Micah has told them. You're going to be judged. God is going to judge you because you've behaved like this. You've coveted. You've been violent. You're not being like God. And what do they say? This is how the ESV puts it. Don't preach. They preach. One shouldn't preach of such things. Disgrace is not going to overtake us. Should it be said, O house of Jacob, has Yahweh grown impatient? Is that how our God is? Do not my words do good to him who works uprightly? That's what God says. See how it switches around? The Bible in basic English makes it even clearer. Let not words like these be dropped, they say. Shame and the curse will not come to the family of Jacob, but God's people. Is the Lord quickly made angry? Are these his doings? Do not his words do good to his people Israel? There's a great warning there, isn't it? Interpreting God using humanism. Probably can't see it back there, but I'll put as a little headline a picture of Eve with the serpent. It's exactly the same thing, isn't it? It's the humanistic spirit. Humanism can't accept a God with absolute rights and wrongs. So much so that even religions can't do it either. They've got to move away. And you know, you hear that, oh, well, God wouldn't expect you to do that. Are these his doings? See, you can see the same way of thinking there. You can't help being like you are. That's a humanistic perspective. You know, whilst humanism seems good for the moment, it's actually the most deceitful thing of all. When the serpent and Eve were talking, and if you're an observer, and when Eve said that God said, the day you eat of the tree, you'll surely die, and the serpent says, you're not going to really die. Which one seems nicer? Well, the serpent's does, doesn't it? Oh, great, I'll go with yours. But it's not, because it's a lie. And ultimately, humanism is a lie. God wouldn't expect you is a very dangerous opening line for our interpretation of God. God tells us what he does expect. You can't help being like this has never been an excuse for how we are expected to fight against our mortality, our mortal nature, our natural tendency to sin. Now, God will forgive us, absolutely, and we don't deserve it, graciously, mercifully, but minimising God's expectations or minimising his holiness, downplaying the righteousness, downplaying the jealousy of our God is absolutely akin to thou shalt not surely die. And you know, the reason for the inevitable consequences that were going to come on the people is explained in verse 8 through 11. The issue was the people had itching ears. And again, this is a little easier to understand in the ESV. And I am out of time, so I will shoot past this rapidly. But just pick up this last bit. You know, the problem is the people had itching ears. If someone went about, so the ESV says, and uttered wind and lies, I mean, this is pretty graphic language, isn't it? And they said, I'll preach to you of wine and strong drink, you'd have him in an instant. Up on your platform, he's the man. And God doesn't, well, Micah and God, they don't mince their words, do they? They don't clothe them with this sort of appearance of godliness. No, they just say it as it is. You'll take people that are basically belching out information on what you should eat and drink. That's why the inevitable consequences would happen. But I want to finish just by this last bit in verse 12 and 13. What a beautiful section it is. Now, we did very briefly say when we were going in our introductory study that this is the deliverance section. You can see the complete change in tone that comes from there. God has been talking about the reasons why and what the consequences of their actions would be and the disasters that would happen as a consequence of their ungodliness. And then he gets to this beautiful section in verses 12 and 13, the deliverance of them. And despite the ungodliness of the people, despite their false prophets that were belching out wind, God provides a vision of a great hope for those that will listen. And again, I do sort of apologise for continuing to use the ESV, but it just is easier to understand in some of these sections here. I will surely